we identified the concept of dynamic data masking and the concept of shortcuts in the lakehouse. Now, the shortcuts supports two types of sources. One is internal sources that are within the Fabric One Lake ecosystem, and another is for external sources like some of the storage layers of GCP, that is Google Cloud Platform, AWS, and even within Microsoft platform like Azure Data Lake, Azure Blob Storage, and Dataverse. So the one aspect that we saw was in the shortcuts can be created at the table layer in the lakehouse or at the file layer in the lakehouse. Now, in order for a shortcut to materialize properly in the table layer, the underlying data must be in the form of delta parquet file itself. If it is just parquet or some other file formats, it won't be supported in the table structure. It would come under not assigned, and then it has to be moved to the file layer of the shortcut, wherein any files can be managed as a shortcut. But in the file section, the shortcut can be created at a folder level, unlike table, wherein table needs, we can specifically select across. So this was with respect to shortcuts. Now, one thing that was confusing was on what basis is the authentication happening? Meaning, if I have two lakehouses, I'm creating a shortcut from lakehouse A in lakehouse B. And if some user who has access on lakehouse B but does not have lakehouse A, would he or she be able to access that shortcut or not? But we were seeing some difference of data, right? Though the user does not have access, he or she was able to see the data, etc. So what is the thought behind that? So that's one aspect that I want you all to identify yourself, and post that and by the subsequent weekend session we'll discuss on that particular case study. Now, we had also seen dynamic data masking, wherein in the lakehouse the dynamic data masking is supported in the SQL Analytics endpoint only, and for the users with viewer access at the workspace level would be able to see the data in the mask state. And there are 4 types of masking, and depending upon the data types, you can select the appropriate type of masking that you all need. So this is with respect to the dynamic data masking. Now, the dynamic data masking is not only specific for the SQL Analytics endpoint, whereas it is also applicable to the Fabric warehouse as well. And then we shifted to the Fabric warehouse. Now, the Fabric warehouse is basically a structured database that Microsoft provides, which is equivalent to the Synapse serverless version of the in the Synapse workspace. It's an OLAP system that is beneficial for analytical aspect, hence the name warehouse. So one can consider similar to how the lakehouse is the data lake equivalent in the Fabric ecosystem. Fabric warehouse can be considered as the data warehouse equivalent in the Fabric ecosystem. Now, within Microsoft Fabric Warehouse, we saw there were two concepts. There was something called as a restore point, and there was something called as a snapshot. Now, what is the difference between those two? And does it consume additional storage space, etc.? That's what we had to identify. Now, one aspect that we saw was with respect to this scope was, now let's take this scenario, correct, wherein I have a warehouse snapshot and I have a warehouse restore point. Now, we saw that the restore point gets created every 8 hours. What I mean by that is, in case if I go to the warehouse settings, under restore points, I see that the restore points allow you to restore warehouse to a previous version. The system creates a restore point every 8 hours. And of course, I can create my own restore point, that is user defined restore point, and it is added by Nandan. and all restore points are retained for 30 days before being auto-deleted by Microsoft itself. Now, in case if I want restore point is, if I have to restore the entire current production warehouse to that state, that is when we use restore point. Restore point overrides the existing warehouse itself rather than creating a replica of that warehouse. And it is created every 8 hours, or we can manually create it ourselves. So imagine that if I want to make any major production deployment, what I can do is before doing that production deployment, I can create a manual restore point, do the deployment. Imagine that if during the deployment there's some major break or changes that are happening, then I can restore the warehouse to its original point before the production deployment itself. Those are the benefits of restore points. Now, as I stated, that restore point is created every 8 hours and it is retained for 30 days. So now, my question to you all is, would the restore, are the restore points consuming additional storage layer? Meaning, it's creating restore points, correct? So does that mean the restore points are consuming the additional storage layer in the one lake? Yes or no?
It should, yeah.
Yes,
Yes.
Nanda.
Yes.
Do think about the concept of time travel as well, correct? So do you all still feel it's consuming this additional layer? So the answer to that is it is consuming some amount of this, but not equivalent to, meaning, let's take an example that the warehouse is 10 GB. So do you mean to say I have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, meaning n number of restore points into the overall size of the warehouse? The answer to that is no. Correct. It is because what happens is it's only the metadata that is copied, while metadata meaning the structural aspect, etc., the JSON aspect, the transactional aspect, and the underlying data, which is the parquet, is still the same files that is present for the original lake warehouse that we had seen. Correct. So when you create a restore point, the Fabric warehouse is only copying the metadata while still referencing the data files from the OneLake itself. It's just the metadata that is copied while the Parquet files are not copied. So it's the additional hardly less than 1 GB space of your metadata that is being created and not the uh, entire data that is getting copied or cloned or duplicated. Am I clear on that aspect?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, my question is, the restore point gets created every 8 hours, correct? Now, my restore point is getting created every 8 hours because I'm using a trial workspace. What if I'm using a fabric capacity and my fabric capacity is in per state? Would the restore point still continue to get created?
No.
Yes or no? Give some thought beyond that. Sorry. The answer to that is, as long as the fabric capacity is paused, you can't access any of the lake house or anything, correct? So even user-defined restore points cannot be created and auto restore points are also not created. So as long as the capacity in pause state, fabric restore points are not created or you cannot create it yourself. Then the retention period of the fabric where the restore point is, we said it is 30 days, correct? But at a point in time, you saw, correct? There were multiple restore points that I was able to see. I was able to see multiple restore points here, correct? At a time, there can be only maximum 180 system generated restore points. Meaning, imagine that I create multiple user defined aspect as well, correct? So at a point in time, there can be only 30 restore points, 180 restore points in general. That if there are more than that, you cannot create additional restore points and you have to explicitly delete them. So any queries on that aspect?
And then you said 30 restore points, right? Maximum.
No, I said 180 restore points maximum and restore points are retained for a span of 30 days.
30
Okay.
days. 30 days. Okay, okay.
So it would automatically get deleted if it exceeds beyond 30 days.
Okay, okay.
Clear?
Yes, yes.
Yes. Yes.
So this is what we saw with respect to the restore point. Then there was something called as warehouse snapshot and time travel. Now the time travel is equivalent to the snapshot or the restore point itself, but it is at entity by entity level. But imagine your entire warehouse got corrupted, it becomes very difficult to scan across and make changes across every entity and restore it to its original state. Hence, in such scenarios, the best aspect is to leverage a restore point itself or a warehouse snapshot. Now, what is warehouse snapshot? So it creates this. So under the management aspect, you can create a snapshot of the warehouse at any state which is past 30 days, meaning in the past 30 days itself. Now the captured data stays consistent for query, meaning now I can create this snapshot of the warehouse at any point of the time from today till last 30 days. And that would create a corresponding snapshot. What that would do is that we saw is it creates a child item. Now you can see that I got a failure message. It is because the specified snapshot date must be before the current timestamp itself, meaning I provided the wrong aspect. So let me create a snapshot as of current state itself. But still I am getting the error. The display name is not available. What is the case? Correct. SN31. Now the reason is, what happens is, though the previous fabric snapshot didn't get created, SN2, but there is still some existing cache which didn't get cleared. Hence, when I try to recreate an SN2, it stated that display name is not available yet because fabric is yet to clean up that cache. And you cannot have multiple snapshots with the same name. You all can see that under the fabric warehouse, which is the parent, it created the child item SN31. So the snapshots are created as child item within the existing fabric warehouse itself. Any queries up till now?
So while the snapshot is getting created, it is directly using the restore point, or it is identifying the point, whatever we have requested, and then it is doing the time travel to restore at that point of time.
Perfect. So the restore points are as of specific times itself, correct? And I am controlling it's every 8 hours, correct? Whereas in this case, I'm providing a specific time. Imagine that if the restore point is not at that specific time. So basically what it does is, it scans across those aspects of your log transaction files, and it's via time travel that it creates a snapshot of that aspect. So my question comes similar. does the snapshot consume additional data? Storage layer.
No.
Some aspect like the metadata, but in general, it is referencing the actual data that is present within the original
Time.
one lake itself, the parent item itself.
Mm.
Correct? Any queries up till now? Now,
No.
whatever permissions are present in the parent get replicated into the corresponding snapshot. Now, let me go into this snapshot. Any one snapshot. I see that there are multiple tables, correct? Let me execute a query. Select all from dbo.date. So now I execute this query. It provides me the data as of that instance. And you saw a message here, correct? The message states that the current version of the data being accessed is as of this timestamp, meaning this is the timestamp as of that snapshot that I created, correct? So imagine that in case if I want, so this is one aspect that when you execute this query, this states that the data is as of this corresponding timestamp that we had created, this snapshot. It's not when on what day I had created this snapshot, but it is the time of which point I had created this snapshot. I hope I made it clear. Imagine that I created the snapshot today. It won't show me the snapshot time as of today. It would show me of what time period I had taken the snapshot of this warehouse. Now, the warehouse snapshot that we created are valid only up till 30 days. Now, imagine that it's valid only for 30 days. Correct? Imagine I want to preserve the snapshot for more time. Can you see this is also Fabric warehouse itself? But am I able to see a management point for this? Meaning, can I create a snapshot of this snapshot? No. Correct? Hence, in such aspect, what I can do is, before we go that route, correct? Another major aspect is the snapshot is a read-only replica. Since it's a child item, what I mean by read-only replica is I cannot create any tables. I cannot modify the data, meaning it's similar to the SQL Analytics endpoint itself, wherein, but unlike SQL Analytics endpoint, wherein I can create views, etc., here it's just a read only. You cannot do anything. You can't even create views. You cannot even alter table, etc. So it's a read only replica that is created as a part of snapshot. Now, the only execution update that you can do in the snapshot aspect is to alter the timestamp. Meaning, if you all saw when I executed this query, I saw the timestamp as 062, correct? But as I stated that I want to manage a snapshot of the retention period is 30 days. So now if I want to update it from 06 to let's say 09. Correct? So now I need to provide the snapshot name, which is WH underscore snapshot. So I can set the corresponding timestamp to the corresponding value. And now in case if I execute this, okay, what happened? I'm not able to see any data. It is showing me the current version of data being accessed is as of this timestamp. Correct. But I'm not able to see any data because as of this timestamp, I had truncated the table. Hence, I am not able to see the corresponding data within that. So depending, rather than every time creating a new snapshot, what you can do is the snapshot warehouse that is already created, you can alter the corresponding timestamp itself. That would automatically take you to that point in time itself. Because this is a read-only endpoint that is actually referencing the underlying parent tables delta parquet files as references. So team, any queries before we proceed ahead? So this is what we had covered in yesterday's session, but I covered some additional aspects with respect to the duration and the storage aspect pertaining to the snapshot and the point in time. Any queries? Now, coming to the other aspect, that is, unlike the fabric lakehouse, wherein under the table aspect, there were additional aspects like maintenance, wherein in maintenance, we saw that there was optimize, V-order, etc. Correct. But in case of fabric warehouse, I'm not even able to see the underlying files nor the maintenance options, etc. The only option that I'm seeing is something called as a clone table. Now, what is clone table? Let's understand that concept. So imagine that I have a geography table in production. I want to do some data modifications and test out that data before making any changes. But I cannot directly make changes in this production live table. I have to make changes in a version. So it's like I'm creating a clone of this table for myself for some proof of concept purpose or some testing purposes. So in that, if I click on the clone table, if I click on the clone table, it gives me an option to basically clone the table as of the corresponding state. Now, everywhere you might be seeing correct last 30 days because it's the concept of cleanup that happens. I'll come to that maintenance aspect. So, as of now, via clone table, I can clone the table as of the current state or in the past 30 days in case as of that corresponding timestamp if I want, similar to how we had done for the corresponding time travel aspects. At that time, at the backend, what it is doing is it is actually creating a SQL statement that is getting executed. So either we all can clone a table from portal via the UI functionality or write a SQL statement and execute it. And it is this SQL statement wherein create table as I'm creating a new table as clone of the corresponding table at this particular timestamp. Or I can take the current one. In the current one, it is as of the current clone itself. So now when I execute the statement, a corresponding clone table gets created and it also has the same data as of that corresponding time. Now, does that mean the data is getting duplicated? No. What happens is when you clone a table, it follows the similar concept that the underlying parquet data is still the same, which is of the original table. Correct? So the data actually is not, it's in the clone aspect. It is just the metadata that is getting the cloned or duplicated, but the storage layer is still this, the data storage aspect or the parquet files are still the same of the underlying source table itself. So now, my question is, In case if I am stating that my underlying storage layer is the underlying data file is still the same. It's just the metadata that is getting copied. So does it mean that in case if I make any update in the original table, it would automatically get reflected in the new table? Yes or no?
No.
Mm,
That would be in the current state then, right?
Okay, so let me ask the other way around. Can I make any data changes in this clone table?
no.
Okay. Okay, let me clone this restored table. So, two questions, correct? I have the original table and I have the cloned table. So, would the clone table be a read-only aspect similar to how we had warehouse snapshot, or can I modify the data in this table?
It should be read only. We cannot modify.
What about others?
Should be able to update.
Okay, so let me try something. Truncate table. So now let me try to truncate this table. Okay, the table got truncated. Does it mean the underlying data, the base table also got truncated?
No.
Yes or no?
No.
Let's validate that as well. So, unlike the warehouse snapshots, etc., once you clone a table, though the metadata gets copied, the data does not remain the same. That is the initial point in the time. But eventually, both tables are independent tables. So whatever changes you start making in the original table, it will start capturing its transaction aspect. And whatever changes you make in the restored or the cloned version of the table, it will start mapping its own set of transactions. But the original point of the Parquet aspect would remain the original table itself. Hence,
So,
that
Nandan,
allows,
then does it create a new Parquet file for this clone?
it would create a new Parquet file for the latest transactional aspect or the latest data updates that I'm creating.
Incremental updates. Okay.
Incremental updates.
Okay.
So now, up till now, whatever I had said, now imagine that if I drop this restored table or the clone table, would it have any impact on the original table?
No.
No. No.
Now, vice versa. What if I drop the original table? Would it have any impact on the cloned table?
No.
I,
It's a bit
ideally,
confused, but ideally it should. But now it's both are independent. But
So what would happen? Any guess? Let me drop this table. Now let me try the select query to this table. This would fail, correct? Stating that there is no such object that is present. Invalid object name. Now, in case if I execute the cloned version of the table, it's in truncated state. It's in truncated state because I had truncated the table. So imagine that if I drop the Hackney license table, I'll still be able to access the Hackney license clone table. Why? Didn't I say that the Parquet file initially is the same aspect? And when I drop the table, doesn't the underlying Parquet files and the corresponding log transaction files get deleted? So in this case, if you drop the original table, still the clone table is intact because there was a dependency, hence it didn't delete the corresponding Parquet file. It deleted the remainder of the Parquet files. Like in case, imagine that in case if there were multiple more transactions that would have happened on this original table, post creating the clone, it would have got rid of all other Parquet files, except the one wherein at the time of the clone that was created, it would still point to that corresponding Parquet. Hence, since there is a dependency of that Parquet file, this clone table is still intact because the underlying Parquet file didn't get deleted because of this drop command. Hence, once you create a clone, both the tables are independent. You can do whatever to one irrespective of the other. So, any queries on the concept of Fabric Warehouse up till now? Now, coming to the next.
Just one question. Can you time travel beyond the clone time on the table?
Sorry, can you time travel beyond?
Beyond the creation date
No.
of the clone table.
On the original table you can do, but not in the clone table because it got created at that time.
But it is using the reference of that.
Once a table is created, it becomes independent. It
Hmm.
does not care about the original aspect. So it has its own set of logs. Correct. So once a new schema is created, it is from that point. There was a case study as well that I had asked you all at that would have made this concept much more clearer. In the case study, I had asked you all to create a table in the lakehouse or in the fabric warehouse, do some data modification and identify the time travel. Post that, make change in the schema of the table and then check whether you can time travel back. Once the structure changes, you cannot time travel beyond that aspect. Since the clone table got created at that, a new structure got created, you cannot go beyond that structure because you are time traveling for that corresponding piece, not the other aspect from it which it got created. It's an independent aspect. Clear? If you want to do time travel, go to the original table from which you created the clone. Am I clear? Now, the
Yes.
final aspect that we saw was with respect to the collation. Correct? We saw that Fabric Warehouse supports only two types of collations. So, do you all remember on that aspect? On how to identify the collations, etc.? Yes or no? Okay, I guess no. So basically, in case if I execute this query, this provides me the list of collation that the Fabric Warehouse or the SQL Analytics endpoint supports. And this query provides me the corresponding collation that is present of the current warehouse. So if I go to result 2, I see that it's UTF-8. So whenever you create a Fabric Warehouse, from the portal, Fabric portal, by default, it gets created with a binary collation, meaning case sensitive and action sensitive. And there is no way wherein we can govern or we can get an option to change the collation. at the Fabric portal level as of today. The collation of the SQL Analytics endpoint cannot be updated by any aspect. And even once the Fabric warehouse is created, it cannot be updated or modified. But for Fabric warehouse, Microsoft does provide a REST API, and it's via REST API that while creating the Fabric warehouse from some automation, you can update the collation. You can create the warehouse of the specific collation at the runtime. But remember, once the warehouse is created, you cannot modify the collation. It's only while creating the warehouse, leveraging the REST API through automation that I can provide or I can parameterize whether I want to create warehouse of this collation or this collation. And that's what we'll see now. Now, at the end of our boot camp, we would be seeing automation aspect. But for now, for layman terminology, I'll explain this basic aspect. Yeah. Basically, I'm using PowerShell for the automation aspect. And PowerShell has multiple modules. Now, what do you mean by modules? Those who are familiar with Python, in Python, you have packages. So modules are similar to packages wherein you have fixed set of codes and commands that Microsoft has already created, and you can import that so that you need not reciprocate the code that Microsoft or someone, correct? Modules can be created by even public folks or even Microsoft, correct? So it's basically like a function or a common logic that someone has already published, kept it in a dedicated library, and you can leverage that. Now, this is a Microsoft module called AZ account, that is Azure accounts, that helps install all authentication aspects for me to authenticate via my corresponding account. Now, I want to create a warehouse with the name, I'm parameterizing. Let's say I want to create a warehouse with name case insensitive underscore warehouse. Now, workspace ID. How to get the corresponding workspace ID? The workspace ID is basically once you log in into any workspace, correct? You see this URL app.powerbi.com/group/some ID. So this ID is basically the workspace ID. Within a tenant, every workspace would have its own unique ID that we had already discussed across during our initial concept of creating a workspace. So I'll be copying this workspace ID. I can add a description. Now the collation that I can pass is one of the two collation that is supported, correct? So for this case, I'm using this collation, that is the case insensitive one. So I'm using the case insensitive collation. Then I imported the module and now I'm trying to connect to an account. So it will provide me a pop-up. Now my account can be part of multiple tenants. If you all remember, correct? An account belongs to an original tenant and it can be a guest user in multiple tenants. Now, in case if I'm trying to connect an account to a particular Fabric or a particular portal, I need to provide which tenant I'm trying to connect to. Hence, I'm providing that leverage connect via my account and connect to the corresponding tenant. And hence, I'm providing the tenant ID. Now, resource URI. Since I'm connecting, I want to create a Fabric warehouse. It's a Fabric component. Hence, I have to create a token. If you all remember, when we had seen the service principle, there were enterprise applications. There were three types of application: Microsoft application, managed identity application, and enterprise applications. In that Microsoft application, you get a resource URI that we had taken. That is unique resource identifier. So for the Fabric, this is the unique or this is the resource URI that we use. So what basically is happening is I would be using my account, generating an OAuth token by authenticating to this resource URI in my Azure Active Directory. And I'm extracting a token from this resource URI by authenticating to this resource URI. And then Microsoft has provided with the REST API. And via this invoke web request, which is an internal PowerShell function to invoke APIs, I'm providing the corresponding request. And since I want to create something, I'm executing a post method. This might be somewhat confusing to those who are new to the concept of REST APIs. For now, just take it with a pinch of salt and let's proceed. But at the end, we would eventually understand what these different concepts mean. But just remember that since I want to create something, there are different methods in APIs, like get method. Get meaning in case if I want to get some data from an API, it's get. But since I want to create something new, I am using post method. I am using post method for the same. So now with respect to that, since I want to create a new Fabric warehouse, I'm using the post method and I'm using this URI and I'm passing the token that I generated, because only if I have access on the workspace, because I've provided the workspace ID, meaning I need to have the proper authorization. I did though generated a token at a API resource URI that is at Fabric, but I should be authorized to access that workspace to create that, meaning the account needs to have at least a contributor and above access. Hence, for that corresponding workspace, in case if I have access, I'll be able to post and create that. Post that, I'm checking whether my corresponding response was success. Hence, I'm using the get method because I want to get that data. So this is some advanced aspect of API automation, API leverage and automation use cases. But for now, in this session, let's not get deep dive into the code. But just in order for you all to understand that, yes, it is possible to create a Fabric warehouse with case insensitive collation as well. So now a pop-up came in wherein I have to sign in to an account. So since I had already connected prior to this call, my MFA was already possible. But in case a user account, I have to provide the corresponding username and password and then enable MFA and then it gets connected. So now here it is stating that this tenant contains more than one active subscription. Correct. So in order, if I want to select some specific subscriptions, etc., if I want to do automation at subscription level, I have to select. But since this is more at the Fabric tenant level, it didn't matter. Now, once I executed this PowerShell command, it initially connected this account to the corresponding tenant and a default subscription. The subscription does not matter to me since we are connecting to the Fabric portal. And then it went ahead and in this tenant under this workspace created a Fabric warehouse. Now let's take a look with respect to the Fabric warehouse. So we created it here. Correct. So let me refresh the page. We all can see, correct, here. I have a case insensitive warehouse that I created. Now let me try and checking the collation of the same. So in case if I execute a new query, I'll see that this warehouse is now case insensitive. Unlike the original warehouse, when you create from portal the default warehouse, it's always case sensitive. So I'll iterate again. Once a Fabric warehouse is created, one cannot modify the collation once it's created. But via the REST API, while creating the Fabric warehouse itself, one can select either of these two collation warehouse to be created. And in that way, I can create a Fabric warehouse with a case insensitive collation. So any queries up till now, but that is not possible for SQL Analytics endpoint as of today. Now, let me go ahead and connect to my Fabric warehouse, to this Fabric warehouse. So for that, under settings, I'll get the SQL Analytics, SQL endpoint, and I can copy the connection string. So via SSMS, let me connect to this Fabric warehouse. Any queries up till now?
Anand.
Yes, I'm getting an authentication pop-up, so it would take me some time to connect. So team, any queries till that time? Okay, so I'm connecting to my authenticating via the MFA Authenticator app now. And it's connected. Now, if you see under the database section, I can see multiple databases. Because as I stated that at the workspace level, whenever you create something at the workspace level, a unique server gets created and all the SQL Analytics endpoint, like for the lake houses and the warehouse itself is a SQL point, correct? All those map under the same server. Hence, you can cross query between the SQL Analytics endpoint of the lakehouse and the Fabric warehouse within the same workspace. So now, let me go ahead and create a view in the Fabric warehouse, in the case sensitive Fabric warehouse, correct? So create view dbo dot view1 as select select A comma B union all, select A comma B. Rather than union all, let me execute union. What union statement does is it basically removes duplicate. Since A, B, okay, sorry, my fault. Since this is case sensitive, insensitive warehouse, capital A, B and small a, B are one and the same. So let me create this view. Now it failed because I have to provide the corresponding column name, correct? So now I created a view with two columns. Select all from dbo dot view1. Now let me similarly create a view in the case sensitive warehouse. Now let me execute this view. Since this is a case sensitive warehouse, it is considering capital, uppercase and lowercase as two different rows. Now let me try to join these two tables. So select all from dbo.view1, correct? Left to join ci underscore warehouse dot dbo dot view1 be on a dot c1 equal to b dot c1. Basically, what I'm doing is I'm trying to join I'm trying to join the tables or the views that are present across a case sensitive warehouse and a case insensitive warehouse. And I'm able to cross query between warehouses because these two belong to the same workspace. So now in case if I execute this, it would fail because in order for me to join between two tables, and I'm joining them on two columns. So in order to join, the underlying collision must be same, meaning they must have same properties based on which I can do the comparison. Correct. And in case of view 1 in the corresponding fabric warehouse where I'm executing, it is a case sensitive collision. Whereas in this warehouse from where I'm joining it, this column has a case insensitive collision. And you cannot execute queries that contain collation conflicts. So in that case, if you all remember the collation hierarchy, the collation is at a server level, database level, column level, and then it can be at a expression level as well. So now what I can do is, in order for me to resolve the collation, one aspect that I can do is, I can state that collate database underscore default. It means use the default, meaning I'm explicitly casting this corresponding column to the default collation of the corresponding warehouse where I'm executing this. So now I am able to execute the corresponding query. So now, since this was one way wherein I explicitly casted the case insensitive to the case sensitive here while joining. But does it mean I always have to use the corresponding default collation itself? No, I can explicitly cast this column, which is case sensitive, to case insensitive. So here what I can do is, rather than collate database default, I can state that collate to this specific collation. So now I explicitly casted the original warehouses, the case sensitive warehouse column to case insensitive. So this is what we call as expression level collation use cases. Any queries? So as long as your warehouses are within the same workspaces, you can cross query between them. And also any lakehouse, SQL Analytics endpoint, etc. can be cross queried. So all in all, any SQL Analytics endpoint or warehouses, etc. that are in the same workspace, one can cross query between those SQL Analytics endpoint or the databases. But imagine that if your warehouse is in some another workspace, then that's one of the study that I want to provide you all. Create a warehouse create two workspaces. In one workspace have warehouse 1, in another workspace have warehouse 2, and try calling the table from warehouse 1 in warehouse 2. check whether it's possible or not. Any guess whether it would be possible or not for you all? And similarly would be the case with Lakehouse. So that would be the case study. Create a warehouse lakehouse in workspace 1, create a warehouse lakehouse in workspace 2, and try to connect via SSMS servers and try to cross query between the databases. It is for that aspect that there's something called a shortcut. So basically, you can leverage the concept of shortcut as an intermittent bridge, and that you'll understand once you go through this case study. Now, coming to the final aspect of the fabric, two aspects. Now, within Fabric Warehouse, is workspace the only way to grant access to a Fabric Warehouse? The answer to that is no. The security aspect for all the storage aspect I'll consider at the end of the session once we close the SQL database as well. But along with that, there is something called as row level security that can be implemented within the Fabric Warehouse. So there are majorly two types of security in most of the databases or in most of the aspects that you will discuss. One is called CLS, that is column level security, and another is RLS, that is row level security. Now, what do we mean by RLS and CLS? Imagine that in this table, I am able to see 4 columns. Imagine that there is a requirement wherein the user needs to have access only on these 2 columns and should not be able to see the remainder of the columns. That is what we call as column level security, wherein we want to restrict specific columns to corresponding set of users. Now, though in the Fabric warehouse, one can create a view and grant access to that, or one can, in Lakehouse, there was no direct way for me to restrict access at a specific column. What I could do is I created dynamic data masking, which is a type of column level security itself. But can I restrict anyone from querying that column? That is what we call as column level security. Row level securities, imagine that this was a row with value India, and this is US, or let's say some department or some domains. I want users to only query date, some users, meaning finance users should only be able to query rows that are belonging to finance, etc., rather than query the entire data. That is what we call as row level security. So the row level security is to filter out the rows to which the corresponding user needs to have access to. And column level security is wherein the user needs to only able to query the columns for which he or she should have access to. Now, Fabric Warehouse does support row level security and column level security, which we'll take a look eventually once we cover all the storage aspect. But it is supported. And of course, dynamic data masking is also supported. Finally, let's get back to the aspect that I had said. Similar to the Fabric Lakehouse, the underlying storage of the Fabric Warehouse is also what? A Delta Parquet file format itself. And in the Lakehouse under table section, I was able to view from the portal itself the underlying files, and I was able to optimize it. I was able to V order, Z order, etc. and vacuum. So in Fabric Warehouse, I didn't get that option anywhere. So can anyone state that whether it is possible in Fabric Warehouse or not?
Can you repeat your question, Nandan?
The underlying data
Huh.
of Fabric Warehouse is similar to the Lakehouse, wherein the underlying data is in the form of Delta Parquet
Okay.
itself.
Huh.
Agree?
Huh. Yes.
Now my question is, in the Fabric Lakehouse, I was able to execute optimize command, V order, Z order, or vacuum. Correct? So in Fabric Warehouse, I didn't saw the option in the portal. So does it mean that Fabric Warehouse cannot be optimized, cannot be cleaned up, etc.?
There should be a way
There
somewhere.
should be a way, yes.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, based on our understanding, everything is automate in the Fabric Warehouse itself. We do not have exposure to optimize or execute vacuum command today. So everything is happening in the backend itself. We do not have the flexibility to optimize. Microsoft itself is taking care of the optimization and everything by default. We need not worry about that. So that cleanup, that retention respect of 30 days, etc., is being managed by Microsoft themselves. We do not have that flexibility to manage it on our end. Clear? Hence, that option is not visible to us at the portal level, at the table level. Any queries? So this concludes the Fabric Warehouse. Now remember, I won't be covering the SQL keywords, etc. with Fabric Warehouse. Now Fabric Warehouse does have multiple limitations with respect to the SQL, T-SQL keywords. Not all the T-SQL that is supported in Microsoft as of today is supported in Fabric Warehouse. There are multiple limitations with respect to SQL. So that is when to actually implement the SQL aspect. I won't cover those in detail because that is up to your SQL, which is a prerequisite. Clear? So team, any queries before we move to the next aspect? I'll take it as a no. Then there is we covered Fabric Lakehouse, which is the data lake equivalent. We covered Fabric Warehouse, which is the data warehouse. Now comes the OLTP version of the Fabric storage layer, that is the Fabric SQL database. So unlike Fabric warehouses and other aspects which are still in preview mode, which are in general availability, SQL database still is in preview mode as of today. So now let me go ahead and create a SQL database. This might fail and you will get the reason why. Okay. There is also a limitation. It seems I have cleaned up all the other aspects. What is there is a limit of how many SQL databases you can create at a tenant level. Correct. And I thought I had already exhausted my SQL database limitation, hence a new creation might have failed. But it seems I have already cleaned up the old versions of my SQL databases and hence the new SQL database is getting created. So the Fabric SQL database is basically the OLTP version or the transactional database equivalent in the Fabric ecosystem. And underlying structure on which it is hosted is the Azure SQL database. And since we do not know how Microsoft preserves the underlying storage in the Azure SQL database, hence the storage of the Fabric SQL database is a proprietary storage format of which we do not know. Meaning it's underlying, it does not preserve the data in the form of delta per K. It preserves in some Azure SQL database version, which we do not have knowledge of. Clear? Now, any queries? Similar to the Fabric warehouse and the SQL Analytics endpoint, let's go across each and every option here. First is settings. Endorsement, I can take a aspect later. Then there is something called as connection strings, and we'll come to this a little later. Similar to Fabric warehouse, wherein you had the option to create a restore point. Here, let's come to this restore point a little later. Let's first understand different aspects, simple aspect, and come to the advanced aspects later. Now, Copilot, as I said, is disabled because I am using the Fabric trial capacity. But hence, you can see that it isn't disabled. But once I use a Fabric capacity, a dedicated Fabric capacity, I can leverage Copilot. Now, similar to Fabric warehouse, one can load data into the Fabric SQL database via data pipeline, T-SQL queries, data flow Gen 2, or notebooks. But to start with, I can leverage sample data. So once I click on sample data, it would automatically load some of the sample data that Microsoft has into my corresponding SQL database. So now since I have clicked on sample data, some of the sample data is automatically getting loaded into my Fabric SQL database. Now, we saw that we can load data from these many aspects. Now, there's some fixed templates, meaning imagine that if I want to create some new table, it would automatically populate the corresponding schema, corresponding syntax, and I can leverage this fixed set of templates. So these are the templates to create stored procedure, views, functions, tables, schemas, etc., which are normal SQL syntax, which you can even leverage Copilot for. I can open, similar to how you can open other SQL Analytics endpoints, you can also open here. Now there's something called as performance summary. Now what is this performance summary about? And this GraphQL, this I'll cover in this tomorrow's session. These are some of the advanced concepts. Okay. For now, let's go and check the corresponding test data or the sample data that got created. The moment I got this pop-up of successfully imported the sample data, a new schema got created called sales LT. And within that, I have corresponding set of tables, which is product table. I am able to say a product table, and it would have a corresponding data. Now, let's go and understand what exactly is happening. So if I go to my SSMS, let me refresh my corresponding databases. Okay, in which workspace did I create? Delete trial capacity. Okay. So now, give me 1 minute. Okay. So now, under the databases, let me disconnect and connect it again. Can you all see a new SQL database? A new database got created with the name SQL DB demo. Now let me execute this, because as I stated, every database that gets created within the same workspace, everything would be hosted in a similar server, because corresponding to a workspace, a server gets associated with a unique GUID ID. So now let me execute select all from information underscore schema dot tables. So I can see that there are these many tables that are present in the corresponding database because we had imported the sample data. Now, let me go ahead and check the corresponding collation of this database. Okay, the database that got created is case sensitive. And let me check the collation, different collation that it supports. Okay, these two supports only two collations similar to Fabric Warehouse and SQL Analytics endpoint, Lakehouse SQL Analytics endpoint. Then what is the benefit? Let's check some other aspects. Let me try to create a table. Create table dbo.test C1 integer. Okay. If I'm even unable to query the, if I'm even unable to create tables, correct? Then what is the use of this database that I'm seeing here? Meaning then is Fabric SQL database even of any use? But I'm able to query the data. Let's say sales LT dot product. I guess that was a table called product, correct? Huh? I'm able to query the data similar to the SQL Analytics endpoint, but I'm unable to create table or manipulate the data. So then does it mean that Fabric SQL database cannot be used for any other purposes? The answer to that is it's different database that we have connected as of now. What I mean is whenever you create a SQL database, two child item gets created. One is the default semantic model that is created for all the components, correct? All these for all the storage component, be it Lakehouse, Fabric, Warehouse, the default semantic model gets created. But a SQL Analytics endpoint also got created. And there is a front similar to Lakehouse, and there is a front-end view for the Fabric SQL database and a SQL Analytics endpoint view. So the database that we connected via SSMS or that is present in that corresponding server is the SQL Analytics endpoint of the Fabric SQL database. And all the limitations of the SQL Analytics endpoint that we had discussed with respect to the Lakehouse are applicable for the SQL Analytics endpoint of the Fabric SQL database as well, meaning it's a read-only endpoint wherein you can only create views, etc. But you cannot alter or modify the data or create tables. So then how to connect to the Fabric SQL database front-end point? So for that, if you click on the Fabric SQL database aspect and under settings, the original aspect that we had seen called connection strings. In connection string, you would get the details like, let's go to the JDBC connector, ODBC connector. That would be much more easier. Can you see here server? This is the server name. Now, this is the server name that I want to connect to. Can you see the difference? Let's see this server name. In this server, check the GUID value. The GUID value is at the workspace level, but it is .datawarehouse.fabric.microsoft.com, whereas this is the same GUID value, dot database dot fabric dot microsoft.com. So now this is a new server that I need to connect to, because unlike if you check the GUID value, it's MITC. The GUID value is the same, the server name, initial aspect, but it is database dot fabric dot microsoft.com, whereas this is data warehouse dot fabric dot microsoft.com. This is not the only change. Even the database name is different. This is the database name. Though I provided SQL DB demo, it appended some GUID value to it. It is SQL DB. This is the database name now. So in case if I want to connect to the front end point of the SQL database, I need to get that server name, and I also have to provide the database name explicitly. So this is the database name, SQL DB demo. Now in case if I connect, again it would ask me for authentication, but since I'm trying to connect to a new server for the first time, it would ask me for the MFA, which I'm currently providing. I'm not getting that pop-up. It's taking time. Some internet issue, it seems. Sorry. So now I authenticated it. Now I'm able to connect to the Fabric SQL database. Now, if you all see the server name, the GUID value is the same initially, but it is data warehouse dot database. So now in case if I query this database, meaning dot database endpoint, and let's check this aspect. That is, let's check the corresponding collation of the front end point. If you see the default collation of this database endpoint, the endpoint on the SQL Analytics endpoint is case insensitive. Also, let's validate which all collation the data Fabric SQL database supports. Unlike the SQL Analytics endpoint, Fabric Warehouse, Fabric SQL database supports these many collations, which is similar to the support that the Azure SQL database provides, because the underlying structure of the Fabric SQL database is the Azure SQL database itself. And now I can go and create my tables. So now in case if I execute select DBO, now since this is case insensitive, I can execute this query as well. I can see that the table is blank. So the SQL Analytics endpoint is a read-only endpoint of the Fabric SQL database, and this is the front-end point wherein you can update, manipulate the data. Whatever changes happens here gets replicated in the SQL Analytics endpoint, but with some lag, similar to that we had seen with the Fabric Lakehouse as well, correct? In the Lakehouse, even if the table was getting created, the SQL Analytics endpoint was taking some time to replicate it. Similar is the case with this. Then what is the use of having a SQL Analytics endpoint? It is because in the Fabric SQL database, let's take this scenario, correct? Wherein in Fabric Warehouse, I was able to query, cross query. Now, in the SQL Analytics endpoint of the Fabric SQL database, since it's hosted on the same server, I can cross query between the Fabric warehouses and lakehouses. But if I try to execute the cross query from the SQL database front end point, I won't be able to cross query because it's in a separate server. It's on an Azure aspect. So since Fabric is an analytical aspect, so in order to cross query between your lake houses just for analysis purpose, Microsoft provides a SQL analytics endpoint for your corresponding OLTP database. Hence, it's a read-only endpoint that one can leverage to cross query between your warehouses and lake houses within the same workspace. But you cannot cross query the SQL analytics endpoints and the databases from the front end or the SQL database connectivity. So any queries on the Fabric SQL database up till now?
And then it created on the same server because it was in the same workspace, right?
Correct.
This SQL endpoint.
So whatever storage aspects that you create, correct, Lakehouse, Fabric, Warehouse, SQL database, etc., as long as they're within the same workspace, all the SQL analytics endpoints are hosted on the same server. Since it's a Fabric SQL database, the front end is somewhat different, unlike the SQL analytics endpoint. Hence, it is mapped on a separate server with the name .database.fabric. So a SQL database has a front end point and a SQL analytics endpoint. Clear? And it's in this front end point that we usually connect to for data ingestion, manipulations, etc. Because the SQL analytics endpoint is a read-only endpoint. Then what is the benefit of that? To cross query between your
Warehouse and
warehouses and lake houses and other aspects that are within the same workspace. Clear? So this concludes today's session.